All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch presentation. As usual, this is a hybrid program. So for those of y'all who are Zooming in, we just ask that you please mute your microphone and use the chat for your questions. We'll have a Q&A session for everybody at the end of the lecture. Also, a reminder that the next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, October 18th at noon with local journalist and author Jeff Hampton. He is going to tell stories about the wild horses of Kerala and their protectors. These horses have roamed the Kurtuk Outer Banks for nearly 500 years, but have faced dramatic changes over the last 4 decades. Representatives from the Kerala Wild Horse Fund will also be available to share information on protecting this vital part of North Carolina's history. Now, today we welcome Frank McMahon, who is the Assistant Site Manager at Historic Halifax State Historic Site, who will highlight the contributions of African-American soldiers from Halifax who fought to bring us our independence during the American Revolutionary War. So please join me in welcoming Mr. McMahon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
My name is Frank McMahon. I'm the Assistant Site Manager over at Historic Halifax State Historic Site. It's nice to be in another part of the Albemarle region today, I'll be talking a little bit about African-American soldiers during the American Revolution. But I also want to, in particular, highlight their connections to Halifax as well. And I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't been to Halifax yet, to come visit the site. We have a lot of new things going on there. We're in the process of, we're going to be renovating our visitor center very soon. So we're going to have all new exhibits very soon in the next few years. So this might be a nice time to come see what we have now and then come visit us again after our renovation is complete. This slideshow that I brought along with me is Black Patriots in Revolutionary Halifax. And I want to give you a little bit of background information. Most of us are familiar with some of these gentlemen. Allen Poor is well known for serving at Concord Bridge and Bunker Hill. He was credited with mortally wounding British Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie. And then there's also Oliver Cromwell, who's a member of the 2nd New Jersey Regiment. Received the Badge of Military Merit during the American Revolution. There's a man named Peter Salem, who served in the Massachusetts militia. He is credited with mortally wounding British Major John Pitcairn. And then there's also the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which is probably the most famous African-American regiment, which offered offered an opportunity to escape enslavement. So for soldiers that joined the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, there'd be, they actively recruited enslaved soldiers, and they were offered in return their freedom. And then there's also James Armistead, who served as a spy for Lafayette during the Yorktown campaign in 1781. And one of the reasons I got into this study and trying to learn more about African-American soldiers from North Carolina was I really wasn't seeing a lot of research out there on it. And so I just wanted to try and put it all into one place, specifically highlighting soldiers with connections to Halifax. So all the soldiers I just mentioned, none of them are specifically North Carolina soldiers. I also want to mention that Historic Halifax is most well known for what we call the Halifax Resolves, which is the first official action of any colonies expressing or seeking independence from Great Britain. So at the Halifax Resolves, which was part of the 4th Provincial Congress, we gave permission for our delegates to eventually sign the Declaration of Independence. The eastern part of North Carolina, with its dependence on plantation economy and production of cash crops like tobacco, rice, and maritime supplies, tended to have a higher percentage of enslaved individuals than the interior colonies. Halifax County was a major tobacco production area, and the colonial taxable records suggested that 40 to 60% of the households were slaveholders. Of slaveholding families in Halifax County, 8.7 enslaved individuals was the average on the 1790 census. And we're going to use the 1790 census a lot. There's not a good census for the colonial period. And so our earliest United States census is the 1790 census. So we'll use that as a reference from time to time. And this is a quote from Royal Governor William Tryon. In 1765, he wrote, "The Negroes are very numerous, I suppose 5 to 1 white persons in the maritime counties, but as you penetrate into the country, few blacks are employed." So there was more African Americans in the eastern counties in North Carolina, higher percentage of African Americans, especially these counties that were dependent on tobacco production. Many of the enslaved African Americans that lived in these counties were also trained in a variety of skills. And here's a 1778 North Carolina Gazette, which reads, "To be sold for ready money, 2 likely young Negro fellows, the one a very good cooper, the other a good sailor, and has also been used to plantation work." So this gentleman was trained as a cooper and a sailor, so he had multiple skills. Again, post-revolution, but right after the revolution, in 1791, George Washington would visit Halifax as part of his Southern tour. And while he was here, he would say that there was 900 people living in Halifax, which doesn't sound like a lot of people today. But to put things into perspective, Wilmington, North Carolina, a major seaport here in North Carolina, only had 1,000 people in 1791. And our biggest town in North Carolina was New Bern, and there was only 3,000 people in New Bern at that time. So Halifax at that time was one of the larger towns in North Carolina. Today we have about 250 people that live in Halifax. So we have less people in Halifax today than we did in 1791. Free blacks in the law. The North Carolina Colonial Assembly passed a law in 1715 prohibiting the right to vote amongst free blacks. This was the first in a series of laws that were designed to keep the population of free blacks in the colony small and disenfranchised. Free blacks in Halifax. Both North Carolina and Virginia had laws ordering newly freed slaves to leave their respective colony within 6 months or to be re-enslaved. Many former slaves would leave Virginia and went to North Carolina, and vice versa. Many North Carolinians would go to Virginia. And so you see many of these free African-American families are going to have family members on both sides of the Virginia-North Carolina border. In the 1790 census, free non-whites made up about 3.2% of the population of Halifax County. Free blacks as citizens. In 1737, the king ordered the 1715 voting law repealed. At that point, free blacks could now vote in North Carolina. This is, they were going to be under the same laws as free whites, And so you had to be a property owner also to vote. But free blacks that had owned property were able to vote here in North Carolina during the second half of the colonial period. In 1776, the Fifth Provincial Congress met in Halifax and ratified the state constitution for North Carolina. This document made no distinction between races regarding suffrage. So in our first state constitution, which was ratified in Halifax in 1776, free African Americans were also allowed to vote. Free black property owning men retained the right to vote in North Carolina until 1835. An act to establish a militia for the security and defense of this province. Militia service in North Carolina was compulsory throughout the 18th century, and that all freemen and servants within this province between the age of 16 and 60 shall compose the militia. And this includes free African Americans. So you have free African Americans serving side by side with their white counterparts in the North Carolina militia. This is a map of the militia districts shortly before, right at the beginning of the American Revolution, and you can see that the Halifax district is made up of several other counties, including Edgecombe County, Butte County, and what would later become Warren County. This is an excerpt from a muster roll, and I should mention that these militias, several times a year, they would have what they call militia musters, and they would meet at an approved muster ground. Halifax is one of them. And they would basically do a training, and then afterwards there was usually a party afterwards. And so most men between 16 and 60 are serving in these militias. There's certain caveats to that rule. If you are involved in public infrastructure, you may not have to turn out to a militia muster. For example, if you were working on a ferry, you might not have to turn out. People need a way to cross the rivers to get to the militia muster. Also, if you had a government job or government position, you might not have to turn out to a militia muster. And then also, if you were an active soldier in the British Army, you didn't have to turn out to the colonial militia musters. This is an excerpt from the muster roll of the regiment in Granville County in October of 1754. And most of these militia muster rolls, they don't write on them the race of the soldiers. But we're lucky that on this one, they do take note of that. And you can see in this same militia, you have soldiers that are being identified as, their terminology, Negroes or mulattoes. And you see this name, Chavers, William Chavers, Gilbert Chavers. Later on in this talk, we're going to talk about John Chavis. That name Chavers is another way of spelling the same family name, Chavis. So there's a number of different ways of spelling that name. And we see that name, that's a very common name in families in northern North Carolina and southern Virginia. You'll see families on both sides of the border with that name very commonly. For Halifax, many of the citizens of Halifax originated in Virginia. So many of these people moved from Virginia to Halifax. So on April 19th of 1775, there's the Battle of Lexington and Concord, known today as the shot heard around the world. This is the beginning of basically the shooting war, the fighting in the American Revolution, beginning up in Massachusetts. At the same time that these troubles are starting in Massachusetts, there's also revolution taking place in the South, both in Virginia and in North Carolina. And this is all kind of happening at about the same time. So in 1772, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore and last Royal Governor of Virginia, in a letter to Lord Dartmouth, the British Secretary of State for the colonies, discussed the colonists' fear of a slave revolt and the potential for a foreign power to recruit the support of slaves. So Lord Dunmore, or former royal governor, is already thinking about enslaved individuals as soldiers. On April 20th of 1775, Dunmore removed gunpowder from the magazine in Williamsburg to a British ship. And on April 22nd, in response to an angry mob, Dunmore tells the mayor of Williamsburg that he would be willing to destroy the town and proclaim liberty for slaves. And then on June 8th, Dunmore and his family flee Williamsburg and are living in exile aboard the HMS Valley. So you have this royal governor that's basically kicked out of his governor and is living on a ship off the coast. He wants to try and get his colony back. And so he creates what he calls the Ethiopian Regiment. On November 15th of 1775, Dunmore declares martial law in Virginia. And he writes, "All indentured servants, Negroes or others, appertaining to rebels, free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining his majesty's troops." So he's recruiting from, he's trying to recruit from the enslaved individuals that are being held by the pro-independence, or what he calls rebel colonists. And when you back up and you think about, the eastern coast of both North Carolina and Virginia, where you have more African Americans, or excuse me, more enslaved individuals than you do free people sometimes. One of the greatest fears of these slaveholding colonists is the fear of a slave rebellion. And in their minds of these colonists, Dunmore is basically starting a slave rebellion, or a rebellion among enslaved individuals. On November 17th of 1775, the Virginia Gazette reported one freedom seeker's disappearance as part of a determined resolution to get liberty, as he conceived by flying to Lord Dunmore. I really like that quote because working at Historic Halifax, I'm talking all the time about the Halifax Resolves. And I like this phrasing it as a resolution or a resolve. That this gentleman is also seeking liberty. Within months, Dunmore raised an army of about 300 enslaved and indentured laborers. I should also mention that Halifax is only about 10 miles from the Virginia border. So things that are happening in Virginia are being watched very closely by colonists in North Carolina as well. There's a battle that takes place. So as I mentioned, Dunmore flees his colony, Virginia, and he's living on a British warship. He wants to try and get back Norfolk, Virginia. That was a major port, and he needs a place that the British Army and Navy can land troops and supplies. So he tries to take over Norfolk, or take it back from what he calls the rebels, or the pro-independence Americans. And so on December 9th of 1775, there's a battle in Norfolk. It ends with Dunmore retreating back to his ships. They lose the battle, and then they shell the city of Norfolk so that the Americans, or the rebel forces, can't use that as a shipping location anymore either. So they're shelling the town of Norfolk, and at the same time, I'm going to use the term Patriot forces to refer to pro-independence Americans from time to time. At the same time, the Patriot forces are lighting the town on fire because they don't want the the British to be able to use it as a seaport to land troops. So simply put, the town of Norfolk is destroyed as part of this Battle of Great Bridge. And one of the images down here in the corner, this image right here, is from a post-war image by Benjamin Latrobe that shows a scene of Norfolk and what it looked like in the 1790s. They still had not rebuilt the town at that point. George Washington weighs in on this, and he says, Dunmore should be instantly crushed. Otherwise, like a snowball rolling, his army will get size. And in these images here, we see George Washington with his valet, Billy Lee, who was an enslaved individual that traveled with George Washington throughout the American Revolution period. So let's bring this to North Carolina. Let's talk a little bit about North Carolina and how this affects the Halifax resolves. Rumors and intercepted letters suggest that North Carolina Royal Governor Josiah Martin had plans to provoke a rebellion amongst the enslaved and utilize freedom seekers as part of his army as well. When we get to the Halifax, and this image here is an image of Josiah Martin, the last royal governor of North Carolina. And much like Dunmore, he winds up living in a British ship off the coast. He flees Tryon Palace, and he eventually goes to Southport, North Carolina, to Fort Johnston. Eventually that fort is attacked by colonists, and he flees to a British warship, and he also is essentially ruling North Carolina from a ship off the coast. Amongst other grievances of British rule, the Halifax resolves also reference that the governors in different colonies have declared protection to slaves who should imbrue their hands in the blood of their masters. So that's a quote from the Halifax resolves. And that's a direct reference to both Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor Dunmore, and also to Royal Governor Josiah Martin. And the Patriot fear that these governors were trying to start a rebellion amongst enslaved individuals. April 12th of 1776, we have what we call the Halifax Resolves. Resolved that the delegates from this colony and the Continental Congress be empowered to concur with the delegates of other colonies in declaring independency. So with our royal governor living off the coast, that power vacuum was filled by what we call the Provincial Congress. And the Provincial Congress was made up of individuals elected from the colonies in North Carolina at that time, the counties in North Carolina at that time. And so it was a representational body, and the membership would change during different provincial congresses. We had 2 meetings of the Provincial Congress in Halifax. So the 4th meeting of the Provincial Congress would take place in Halifax. That's when the Halifax Resolves is created. And really what that is that empowers North Carolina's representatives attending the Continental Congress in Philadelphia at the same time to eventually sign the Declaration of Independence, or to vote for independence from Great Britain, which would pave the way to the Declaration of Independence. After the Declaration of Independence happens, the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence in North Carolina would take place in Halifax on August 1st of 1776. And that would be read at the courthouse site in Halifax, North Carolina. And then our first state constitution would be created as part of the 5th Provincial Congress. And that takes place in the fall and the winter of 1776. So this is these Patriot decisions towards independence and liberty are not without critique amongst individuals in Great Britain. And there's a writer named Thomas Day who wrote in 1776, "If there be any object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot signing resolutions of independency with the one hand, and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves." So even at this time, these decisions towards liberty are being criticized by writers at the same time that they're taking place. And the fact that they aren't including liberty for enslaved individuals. While the British offered liberty for enslaved Blacks willing to serve the king, free Blacks had other motivations. Free Blacks served in both the Patriot militias and also the Continental Army. Patriot forces were generally integrated with Black and white soldiers serving side by side. It has been estimated that 5,000 Black soldiers served in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Here's a case study of a man named Billy Flora. He served with the Virginia Southern Princess Anne District Minutemen Battalion at the Battle of Great Bridge on December 9th of 1775. While awaiting reinforcements from Colonel Robert Howe's North Carolina forces, Flora was serving as a sentry when a company of British grenadiers attacked his position. And this is a quote after the battle by one of his other soldiers. Billy Flora, a colored man, was the last sentinel that came into the breastwork, and that he did not leave his post until he had fired several times. Billy had to cross a plank to get into the breastwork and had fairly passed over it when he was seen to turn back and deliberately take up the plank after him amid a shower of musket balls. In 1776, Flora would enlist in the 15th Virginia Regiment and served through the remainder of the war. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Matthews, described him as being held in high esteem as a soldier. African Americans made up 4.8% of North Carolina's Continental Army, rank and file stationed in White Plains, New York in August of 1778. And again, many of these rosters of soldiers serving in the Continental Army don't include race in their description. So it's possible that there's even more African-American soldiers serving in the Continental Army and militias that just were not identified as being African-American soldiers. Here's a list of a few Halifax pension applications that I was able to locate. Again, there's probably more of them that just haven't turned up yet. And I'm always keeping my eyes open for more of these pension applications. These are all gentlemen with connections to Halifax, North Carolina. Edward Going served in the 5th North Carolina Regiment and was stationed in Halifax. Benjamin Wilkins served in the 2nd North Carolina, and he was also a resident of Halifax. And he wrote in his pension that he thinks he has killed at least 50 British and Tories. William Casey, also sometimes spelled Kersey. And I should mention there's not a standardized spelling in the 18th century for a lot of these names. They're usually spelled phonetically. And so oftentimes they're written down by someone else in the case of individuals who may not be able to write. So you'll see multiple spellings of many of these names. William Kersey would serve in the Virginia 4th Regiment, 1777 to 1781. Then the 1st North Carolina Regiment in 1782. He would serve as a waiter to General Sumner of the 1st North Carolina, and he would march through Halifax. As a soldier in the in one of these North Carolina regiments, you might be sent as far north as West Point, New York, or you might be sent as far south as Charleston or South Carolina or Georgia. And most of this is done on foot. So these soldiers are walking really long distances. All of them are, this is a thing that they're all dealing with as a soldier in the Continental Army. Moses Manley served in the 1st and the 2nd North Carolina Regiment. In 1781, he was a 12-month levy, and he was a resident of Halifax. Something that makes researching these soldiers a little bit confusing, and you find in a lot of these pension applications that the soldiers might kind of forget what regiment they were in. You'll see that oftentimes where they'll say, I was in the 3rd Regiment or the 10th, I can't remember. That's partially because these pensions are being applied for when the men are much older. So most of these men, this is in the mid-19th century when they're applying for these pensions. And so these are older men when they're applying for them. And so their memory might be a little bit off. But add another layer of confusion in that North Carolina had 10 regiments at its largest in about 1777, 1778. All of these regiments were underfilled by soldiers. And so at Valley Forge, they consolidated all the regiments down to 3 regiments. And then later they would consolidate them back down to 2 regiments. And so throughout the rest of the war, there's just 2 or 3 regiments of Continental soldiers. So if you had been enlisted in the 10th Regiment, by the time that your tour of duty was over, you might be in the 10th Regiment. And you can see how that would cause some confusion for a soldier to recollect later in life. We have Charles Rowe, who served in the Halifax Militia District and 3rd North Carolina Regiment for 9 months. He was a levy from the militia. A lot of these soldiers are talking about being levies from the militia. So as I mentioned earlier, during the colonial period, all men between 16 and 60 are supposed to be signed up with the militia. When they can't get enough soldiers in the Continental Army, and I should also mention that the colonial militia law is continued into the beginning of the state of North Carolina. So after the Declaration of Independence, we start calling ourselves the state of North Carolina. That same colonial militia law is just continued on into the state government. And so when there's not enough soldiers for the Continental Army, they will levy soldiers out of the militia, draft soldiers out of the militia. And oftentimes you'll see their short-term tours of duty around 12 months, 6 to 12 months is very common. And so there's also, you'll run into with these pension applications, confusion over whether the soldier was in the militia or whether he was in the Continental Army, because that soldier may have been in the militia and then was drafted into the Continental Army for a period of time. Also at times with the militia system, we will occasionally see substitutes as well, where another soldier is substituted, or at times where someone will pay someone else to serve in their place in the Continental Army. We'll see that at times. And also at times we'll see enslaved individuals that serve as substitutes for free individuals in the Continental Army as well. And as well as militias. Served in the 10th North Carolina Regiment in 1778. He was he had a 9-month enlistment and was discharged in Halifax. Joel Taburn served in the 10th North Carolina Regiment from 1776 to 1783. He marched from Halifax, North Carolina to White Plains, New York, then back south again to Charleston, South Carolina, where he was discharged. John Womble served in the 3rd or 10th North Carolina Regiment. He couldn't recollect. 1779 to 1780, he was recruited in Halifax. Arthur Toney served in the 3rd North Carolina Regiment from 1779 to 1783. He was a resident of Halifax. And also John Toney, these gentlemen are brothers, would serve in the 10th North Carolina Regiment 12 months in 1781. Both of them were residents of Halifax. And then I just recently found, I had a friend bring to my attention another pension application for a man named Drury Walden. He served in the Halifax Militia District. He served as a guard at the Halifax jail. And he recollected that the Halifax jail, in his own words, was filled with Tories. And also served at Camp Quonky, which was an artificer camp that was run by Nicholas Long on his Camp Quonky plantation. So Halifax was also a place where they were making equipment and supplies for soldiers in the Continental Army. And Drury Walden was charged with making canteens, building a barracks, and other duties necessary for making equipment for Continental soldiers serving the North Carolina line. John Chavis probably moved to Halifax, North Carolina in 1766 from Sussex County, Virginia, as an indentured servant to the attorney James Milner. And this name Chavis is, as I mentioned earlier, very common for families in northern North Carolina and southern Virginia. Chavis enlisted in December 1778 in the 5th Virginia, and he would serve 3 years. His bounty warrant, written in March of 1783, certified that Chavis had faithfully fulfilled his duties and is thereby entitled to all the immunities granted to a 3-year soldier. In 1789, he was employed as a tutor in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. And in the 1790s, he attended the College of New Jersey, today Princeton University, and later Liberty Hall Academy in Lexington, Virginia, today Washington and Lee University. November 19th of 1800, he was granted a license to preach by the Presbytery of Lexington, Virginia, and served as a minister in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. John Chavis may be the first African-American Presbyterian minister in the United States. This is highly likely. In 1807 or 1808, he relocates to Raleigh and opened a school intended to serve both Black and white children. It appears that the school was initially integrated, but Chavis was pressured into segregating the school by the fall of 1808. August 26th of 1808, edition of the Raleigh Register would explain that John Chavis takes this method of informing his employers and the citizens of Raleigh in general that the present quarter of this school will end the 15th of September and the next will commence on the 19th. He will at the same time open an evening school for the purpose of instructing children of color, as he intends for the accommodation of some of his employers to exclude all children of color from his day school. The evening school will commence at an hour by sun when the white children will leave the house. Those of color will take their places and continue until 10 o'clock. The terms of teaching the white children will be, as usual, $2.50 per quarter, those of color $1.75. In both cases, the whole of the money to be paid in advance to Mr. Benjamin S. King. Those who produce certificates from him of their having paid the money will be admitted. Those who think proper to put their children under his care may rely upon the strictest attention being paid, not only to their education, but to their morals, which he deems an important part of education. August 23rd, 1808. He hopes to have a better schoolhouse by the commencement of the next quarter. So you have John Chavis, a former revolutionary soldier, free African American, running a school in Raleigh. And some of his students would include Priestley H. Magnum, the brother of U.S. Senator Wiley P. Magnum, North Carolina Governor Charles Manley, Archibald E. and John L. Henderson, son of Leonard Henderson, Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, and Abram Rencher, who would serve in the United States House of Representatives. And I have here an image of Wiley P. Magnum. I've read in the Magnum papers even references to John Chavis would write letters regularly to Wiley P. Magnum, and at times would even visit him. Wiley P. Magnum's son would write about how the two of them would give each other a hug when they met. So it appears that they were very close. American independence did not deliver life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for North Carolina's enslaved men, women, and children. August 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion, Nat Turner would lead a revolt of enslaved individuals in Southampton County, Virginia. And this was the worst nightmare of those slaveholding whites in both Southern Virginia and Northern Carolina. This new law forbid the teaching of Black children, and this would lead to laws that would be created that were racist towards African Americans. So you start seeing, as I showed you with the Chavis's school, you see this racism already starting to creep in even before the Nat Turner Rebellion. But the Nat Turner Rebellion in some ways would also exacerbate that racism. And new laws would be created that forbid the teaching of Black children and forbid Blacks from serving as preachers. 1835, North Carolina State Constitution would repeal the right to vote amongst African Americans. It was also estimated that there were 300 Black electors in Halifax at that time that the right to vote was repealed. John Chavis is forced to close his school and leave his ministry, although the Presbyterian Church would continue to support Chavis with $50,000 per year payment until his death in 1838. So this destroys John Chavis's career. You know, he goes from teaching people that are who would become representatives in United States politics, as well as their children, to now he has no way to make a living, really. And John Chavis would write a letter to Wiley P. Magnum, and what he would say is, tell them, and this is in 1832, as the discussion is going on about taking the right to vote from free African Americans. And what John Chavis writes to Wiley Magnum is, tell them, if I am Black, I am free-born American and a revolutionary soldier, and therefore ought not to be thrown entirely out of the scale of notice. So even in that situation, John Chavis saw himself as a member of this American experiment, as a revolutionary soldier, as someone that was seeking liberty side by side with his white counterparts. I encourage you all to come visit us at Historic Halifax State Historic Site. In the last couple of years, we created a traveling exhibit called Seeking Liberty in Halifax. And this exhibit juxtaposes that Halifax Resolves Seeking Liberty story with the story of freedom seekers that traveled through Halifax as well. So we'll use the term freedom seeker to refer to people that are questing liberty, freedom on what we call the Underground Railroad. And after the American Revolution, you see the Underground Railroad start to fully develop as a network to help enslaved individuals escape to freedom or to seek liberty. And Halifax would serve as a stop on the Underground Railroad. And we're recognized, Halifax State Historic Site, the town of Halifax, and the Roanoke River are all recognized by the National Park Service as being members of the Underground Railroad network to freedom. So I encourage you all to come to Halifax. We have about 8 historic buildings that we manage that date from the 1750s to the 1840s. We have a visitor center with a museum you can go through. We have an archaeological museum you can also visit. We also have, we're going to be getting a new visitor center very soon. And I'm very excited about that. I'm hoping that some of these, we're literally rewriting the narrative right now. We're rewriting the exhibits for the museum. And we're incorporating this Seeking Liberty story into our new exhibits that are going to be in the new museum when it is renovated. So we're all very excited about that. We also have an Underground Railroad trail that you can visit in Halifax. So I thank you all very much for coming out and talking to me, or letting me talk to you. Here's your chance to ask me a few questions.
Yes, I know, I was looking at the list of the pension applications. There were like a list of 11 pension applications that had some kind of connection to Halifax. As far as you know, were all of them black soldiers as well, or you're not sure about race?
That list that I just went through, they were all African-American soldiers. Mm-hmm. And there's more that were white soldiers also. And there's probably more African-American soldiers. It just that last one on there, the gentleman's name was Drury, was just brought to my attention, and it wasn't until all the way down at the bottom of the pension that it listed that on one of the censuses that Drury Walden was a free African American. He listed himself as a free African American on the census. In his pension, it's nowhere mentioned. So sometimes you have to cross-reference with the census as well to try and find, to give you a clue of to what race these individuals were. But yeah, everyone from those 11 individuals here in their pensions or other cross-referencing has shown that they're African-American soldiers. Halifax was a major north-south, part of a major north-south route in the late colonial and American Revolution time period. 301, modern 301 goes through Halifax, but that follows roughly historic mail routes that existed in the colonial periods. And so the main way, if you were going to travel from, say, New Bern up to Virginia and points further north, would usually take you through Halifax. And there was a ferry there where you could cross the river. And so it was a strategic point for the Continental Army. Not only was it one of the last stops before you left North Carolina, it was also about as far as you could get a small ocean-going vessel up the Roanoke River. So the first set of rapids was up in Weldon, which is just about, I think, 5 or 6 miles up the river. So they were able to get small ocean-going vessels up to Halifax to bring goods and supplies there. And that's one of the reasons I think that they selected that location to set up an artificer camp, because they could get goods and supplies to the soldiers there. But pretty much almost every North Carolina soldier that traveled north into Virginia and on up into New York would travel through Halifax. It was kind of the jumping off point and also a rendezvous point for Continental soldiers. And there's also references to Native American soldiers that came through Halifax as well. We have 2 or 3 names of soldiers that are associated with being of Tuscarora descent that were also in Halifax at the time that the Continental Army came through. There was even a Tuscarora reservation on the Roanoke River, just downriver from Halifax, on the other side of the river in Bertie County. I hope that answered your question. I kind of went off on a tangent. Other questions?
There are no rankings listed with these applications. I'm assuming they were all listed. Were there many black officers?
So I have not found any reference to black officers. And I think there generally weren't any African-American NCOs. With that said, one could come to light. To my knowledge, I haven't come across any NCOs or officers that were African-Americans. But I'm learning new things all the time. Any other questions? All right, well, it's been my pleasure talking to all of you today. Thank you for coming out.